All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome this evening. My name is Dr. Daniel Holler. I serve as the department chair of psychology at Bethune-Cookman University. My degree is in clinical psychology. My expertise are in the area of suicide risk assessment. I look at research among, looking at suicide among individuals of African descent, as well as suicide in the broader context of the community and among law enforcement personnel. And today, we've invited you all here because, you know, as the year ends and we get ready for the holiday season, oftentimes, even though it's a time for joy and celebration, these can also be times where people feel extreme sadness, depression. They may have lost loved ones this year, and all those things kind of resonate toward the end of the year, and people become at risk for depression, suicide as well. And so what we wanted to do is to just touch bases with you all to let you know about these risks that are out there, as well as some solutions and protective factors that you could engage in so that you have a safe and happy holiday, and that we will see you all in the spring when we return for our 2022 semester. Okay. While we are having today's presentation, please remember to keep your microphones on mute. And if you have a question, please type your question in the chat. We have people who are here to monitor the chat and who will help with moderating and asking questions at the end of the presentations for you all today. And so as is tradition here at Bethune-Cookman University, we are a small private Christian college located here in Daytona Beach, Florida. We will begin, as we do all of our meetings here, by opening with a prayer. And I'd like to ask Dr. Shepard. Dr. Shepard's one of our faculty members here in the psychology department. Many of you know him and enjoy his classes. And so, Dr. Shepard, if you could do us the favor and the honor of starting us off today with a moment of prayer.
Sure will. Thank you, Dr. Holler, and welcome all our guests, our distinguished panels. Guests, we appreciate you taking out time to spend with us today. Let us turn to the Lord. Father God, our Lord and our keeper, we thank you for this opportunity to share as we enter into this wonderful season, Lord, that you've blessed us to be thankful for the bounty of what you've given us, the joy of Christmas, the birth of our Lord and Savior. We want to share and impart upon those that are listening today something that will strengthen them through these holiday seasons, that they will be able to enjoy them as you ordained it to be so, God. Give us the wisdom, the knowledge to share with your people and give them the ears to hear, that they might know what you have set out for them to enjoy and to share across this holiday season with others. We ask that you continue to bless them and bless them as we transition out of the holiday season into a new year. Give us the strength, the encouragement to go forward. In the name of our Lord and Savior, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that, Dr. Shepard. And just so you all know, we don't do anything here in isolation. We often reach out to our colleagues on the west side of Florida, right? So for those of you who don't know, at Florida A&M University, they're kind of known as the Mecca of Black psychology. I used to teach there, and I have very close connections with the faculty there. And many of our students leave Cookman and go on to graduate school at Florida A&M University. Well, they're known as the Mecca, so I like to think of Cookman as the Medina of Black psychology. And we have someone from Florida A&M University with us today, Dr. Flood if you don't mind, would you introduce our moderator for today?
Yes, hello, I am Dr. Mutor Flood. I want to introduce my mentee, Samantha. She's a former student of mine at Florida A&M University, and I'll open the floor to her.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Samantha Petit-Home. I am a recent graduate from Florida A&M University with a bachelor's in psychology. A little bit about me, I am currently a group facilitator at Community Connections for Life, where we facilitate and teach clients who've experienced emotional trauma, social skills that they need to navigate through life. I want to just take a moment to make a dedication to those Black men and women who has committed suicide, not only at Bethune-Cookman campus, but also throughout the world. So let's just take 1 minute to make this dedication. Okay, thank you all so much. So I'm gonna begin with our first speaker, which is Dr. Larry T. Richardson. He'll be presenting the impact of violence, trauma, abuse on African-American children and family and the clinical solutions for health and healing. Dr. Larry T. Richardson has over 29 years of experience in the field of mental health and addiction treatment. He currently operates a full-time private practice behavioral health care business. He is currently a mental health consultant for Jacksonville Job Corps and Jacksonville Jaguar, and a clinical provider for the National Basketball Association. Dr. Richardson has a Bachelor of Science degree in Psychology and Biology from Florida A&M University, a Master's of Art degree in Counseling Psychology from the University of North Florida, and a PhD in Psychology from LaSalle University. Dr. Richardson currently serves as a director of Imani Behavioral Health Science Services. Additionally, he formerly served as the chairman of Jacksonville Chapter Association of Black Psychologists and as the advisory board member of one organization and has membership in 5 professional organizations. He has conducted workshops, seminars, and training at numerous conferences all over the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean. He has served as an adjunct faculty member at University of North Florida and is a former adjunct professor in psychology at Edwards Waters College in Jacksonville, Florida. Everybody, please welcome Dr. Larry T. Richardson.
Okay, hello. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to try to get through this as expeditiously as possible. I'd like to dedicate this to Dr. Yvonne Mahy, who started me on my pilgrimages to Bethune-Cookman University after I met her at the MOTEP Student Research Symposium at FAMU in Tallahassee. So I'm dedicating this to her, and I try to maintain contact with her. And I also appreciate Bethune inviting me to do this. It's always a pleasure and an honor to do something. If someone invites you back, that means that either you were very good or they couldn't find anyone else to do it for you. So I hope that it's because I was been very good and faithful in maintaining contact. So what I'm gonna do is try to walk you through this process. And what I've been doing as part of my clinical practice, I developed an African-centered treatment regimen based on the principles of Mayat and other forms of African practices and history that can work for everyone. You do not have to be African-American or so-called minority. These are universal principles that can work with everyone. Okay, next. So this is the title of this. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. John Henry Clarke. He's a noted psychologist and historian for years. I had the pleasure of going to a number of his presentations. I have many of his books. And as I researched and went back and looked at what were the critical things available or present that could make a difference clinically to reach people to another level. And as I go through, I'm going to explain how the Association of Black Psychologists several years ago received a grant from Center for Disease Control, in which they developed what is called a behavioral change model. And that model was based on getting people to understand and identify who they really are and their authentic self, and then learn a model of behavior that was spiritually based so that they could make better decisions about their mental health and other aspects of their well-being. Okay, next. Okay, this is the summary, and I've presented a version of this in different places and with different components. One of them, of course, I had prevalence and incident information, because some people don't know how big the problem is and how serious it is. But I pulled that out for this presentation and others because of time limits, because this started off as a 3-hour presentation. It's going to review and investigate the impact of violence, trauma, and abuse on African American children and families. It would explore the historical antecedents of the Ma'afa and the effects on the emotional and psychological well-being of African Americans, and will culminate with the culturally centered treatment applications of MIAD. And what I'm going to do in order to change, you have to go back. And one principle of Sankofa is looking back while you're going forward, because if you're not able to understand the aspects of the past that created conditions and circumstances, then you're not able to reconcile the present issue that you're facing. Okay, next. Okay, these are going to be some of the objectives, and they're pretty ambitious. We're going to do a brief overview of the MIAFA, and I'll explain that. And interspersed through the presentations, I'm going to have African proverbs and information from noted African scholars, and some of the proverbs, the author may be unknown. But I'm going to discuss and define the concept of MIAD and cultural structure of African-centered cultural precepts, identify and become familiar with an African-centered clinical model, and review and discuss culturally centered treatment applications. And what I did in my practice, because it was my practice as individual practice, is that I was able to have the freedom to create the processes and paradigms to fit people's needs without any interference from an organization who did not maybe embrace this. Okay, next. Okay. And this is one of the brief definition of MIAFA, also known as the African Holocaust. And this is one of the versions of it. It's a Kiswahili word meaning disaster or terrible occurrence of great tragedy. And I'm not sure if any of you watched all or some of the series that Dr. Gates did. I saw all of them except one, and I'm going to get the videotape. But it really outlined the detail and the seriousness and the horror of this Holocaust, and it's kind of continuing. it really talks about, and I think what I've done is change the language. Instead of slavery, it's enslavement, it's kidnapping, murder, assault, rape. We have to call out things for what they are and not sugarcoat them and call it slavery. It's enslavement, kidnapping, and it was illegal, immoral, and we need to call it out that way so we can understand the significant impact. Okay, next. The other definition also used to describe the experience of instead of African slaves, it should be say, I hadn't changed language, enslaved Africans who traversed the middle, what they call the Middle Passage. And we're gonna see later that there was at least 3 so-called slave trades that we're gonna look at. And it was not just the one, and there was the slave rum triangle that we may mention too. It's called the worst crime against humanity. And I think Dr. I'm trying to think of his name now. He estimated 40 to 100 million people were directly affected by the Atlantic, Arabian, and Trans-Saharan routes. And I think I saw an article on one of the programs, you know, they're still enslaving Africans and from East Africa and enslaving folks. It still is going on. Next. And there's some debate, I guess, about the slave trade, or so-called enslaved trade, or the transatlantic, the period of enslavement of Americans, 1620 to 1865. History will show that Africans were in what is called the United States of America prior to 1620. Some of you may know that the navigator on one of Columbus' ship was an African from Portugal. And I'm sure many of you know, if not, look it up, that Africans ruled Spain for over 400 years. They were called the Moors, and they left vestiges of their culture, their universities, school systems, roads, and those types of things. And some folks look at it as an ongoing, continuous process. But there's a lot of damage was done that's immeasurable. Next. This part talks about how the historic and cultural influence shaped the American family functioning. We're finding out more of this as they make movies and they are digging deeper into history about the impact. It wasn't just enslaving people. It was much more than that. And those things created the beginning of severe psychological and emotional problems for those of African descent. And we're feeling the vestiges of some of that now, and sometimes a little hard to pinpoint, but we see it. And one of the things I've noticed, that one of the reasons we're having as many problems now is that generations stopped passing on protective factors. When you started getting younger grandparents, and then the older folks stopped passing on protective factors for us. They would tell you how to conduct yourself around white people, what to do and not do, how to protect yourself from the wrath of people who hated you. And with so-called integration, we have lost our protective factors, and then people strike out emotionally that create a crime, and then to cope with the trauma, people use drugs, and then there's violence and there's poverty in that cycle. Next. Okay, this is from Dr. John Henry Clarke, his book, that he wrote a lot of books, and he was a great scholar. This is what he has to say. This is a direct quote from his book, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust. He says, the middle passage, our Holocaust, is our Holocaust because this is a Holocaust that started 500 years ago and is not over. We do not start our count at 6 million. We start counting at 60 million, and we have just begun to count. Now, I do not mean to negate the German and the European Holocaust, whether the number was 6 or 60 million, even if it was wrong. But it was a problem started in Europe by Europeans that should have been resolved in Europe by Europeans. There's no comparison between this tragedy and our tragedy, which was the greatest crime in the history of the world. Why haven't we memorialized our dead? They're almost like the crime of not burying them. That was a direct quote from Dr. Clark. Okay, next. First proverb break. If we stand tall, it's because we stand on the shoulders of many ancestors. Other one, until lions tell their story, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And I'm going to intersperse these periodically to connect us to what we're talking about. The next. Power conceded nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. It's Frederick Douglass. Those of you familiar with the civil rights, it started off with peaceful demonstrations, but it got more intense as it went on, and people realized that they had a formidable enemy. We are not Africans because we are born in Africa. We're Africans because Africa is born in us. I hear people all the time say, I'm not African and I'm not related to Africans. It's like saying, y'all say she my grandma, but she ain't my grandma because I don't want to be related to her. And if you read some of the history, you find out that, and I hope I don't disappoint anyone saying this, but African is not an African word, okay? Look it up, look up the origin of it. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was a Portuguese word, and it described how someone looked, not who they were. But I may be wrong. I've been wrong 7 times this year. Okay, next. Yeah, this is about the strengths of African-American families. I just did ancestry search on my great-grandfather because he was one of the founders of the church I attended. And he was born enslaved in Liberty County, Georgia. And he got married and he moved to Florida. He had 5 children. One of those children was ended up being my grandfather. His name was Samuel Patterson. And what's significant about that is that during Reconstruction, he became the first African-American elected to the city council in Green Cove Springs, Florida. And that was significant because African-Americans held many top jobs in legislative and otherwise that we don't hear about. We don't hear about those accomplishments that were taken away later by after the end of Reconstruction. And so it appears there's 3 critical factors that good for interventions. It's culture, ethnicity, spiritual religious beliefs, and practices. These are some of the things. And I submit that race is not an accurate way to describe people. It's their culture and their ethnicity, their tribes, their nations, and that's who they are. And it's not by color. Color was created by white anthropologists so that they could promote that Caucasians were superior. Okay, next. Okay, this is the Associates of Black Psychologists developed the African-centered behavior change model through a grant from the CDC, and I was one of the consultants that worked. I think it was 6 years altogether I worked, and they used it was for the prevention of HIV/AIDS and sexually transmitted diseases, and they created this model so that you could use culture as a basis to get people to change negative behaviors, especially in thinking differently about who they were as important people that had positive contributions to make. The 3 critical elements were perpetual veneration, interconnectedness, and spiritual oneness. I'm going to define these in the next couple of slides. Next. Okay, these are the 3 core concepts of Ma'at, and I won't take it for granted everyone's familiar with the concept of Ma'at by the ancient Egyptians, which they portrayed as not being African, but they were. That was a central focus of civilization at that time. The University of Carthage, which was the intellectual center of the entire earth at one time, but Africans were too kind and liberal, and they were defeated, and they pillaged the university and took all their manuscripts and information to Europe, and that was the beginning of the golden age in Greece and the Roman Empire. That was a result of African information and intellectual expertise. So these are 3 core concepts. It's the fundamental quality of belonging, being, and becoming. And that's a model for personality and social development. Belonging. Who do you belong to? Who are your folks? A sense of being. Being is used from the word to be, the verb to be, meaning a concept of your state of who you are. Then becoming, what is your potential as a person to continue to grow and develop as a human being, and be able to pass that on to your future generations. As human beings, people of African ancestry have the right and responsibility to center themselves, as a result, reproduce and refine the best of themselves. Centering has to do with stopping, find out who you are, where you want to go, and then be able to lead others in a positive direction. Next. Okay, we're gonna talk about the concept of spiritness. Now, don't nobody get mad at me about this. It's not atheist or anti-God or anti-Christianity. Christianity was created by Africans in Africa. The oldest form of practicing Christianity is still practiced in Ethiopia. And the oldest form of Judaism is also centered there too. And you can look that up and then challenge me on saying that. But this is the concept of spirit and the power of spirit. Africans believe that spirit was the energy, force, or power. Spirit, both the inner essence and outer envelope of human beingness. Who we are has to do with our belief and acceptance of the power of spirit to govern our lives and define who we are. Spirit serves to ignite and enliven the human state of being. Spirit gives us that power to be the best we can be, and all the skills that we have to become the best possible person. Okay, next. Virtues of my art. And I use these, I operationalize these to use when I work with adults and with teenagers. It's a social standard of living. in how we supposed to conduct ourselves. And I'm sure many of you have heard or just been shared with you. Truth, justice, reciprocity, compassion, balance, harmony, and order. These are things that all of us should be practicing as human beings with ourselves and with others. And these are virtues. And these can be, like I said, they could be operationalized and become part of your life and who you are. Next. Veneration of the person. I love this word, veneration. I absolutely love this word. To venerate someone is to hold them in the highest possible respect. I mean, the highest respect is to venerate a person. So to be a person is to be a living being and possessing, knowing, and a knowledgeable spirit. That spiritual power got me through my dissertation. I was mad, I was upset, I was frustrated. I said, I'm going to beat some folks up and I'm going to hurt some people. But that's what I was saying. And when I went to sleep and I woke up, and my grandmother had given me this message about who I was and who I was to be. She had prophesied that I was going to be a doctor when I was 9 or 10 years old. And of course, I didn't believe her. I said, well, this old lady, you know, what does she know? Lo and behold, years later, I did my dissertation, defended it, and I be a doctor. How about that? My grandmama was the smartest person I knew. So a person also both contain an instrument of divine energy and relationship. We're supposed to be divine people. Divine people don't beat people up, rob people, hurt people, cuss people out. It's an energy. It's defined by uniqueness, relatedness. Have you ever heard somebody describe you this way or someone else? Connection, coherence with a common spirit. Human beings are power, phenomenon of perpetual veneration with diverse high regard and deep respect. Man, that's deep. What if we practice that? You know, next. Okay, I'm gonna quickly go through these. Mild is concerned with all spirits of reality. The Africans believed that we were part of the universe and we were not Floridians or Georgians or we lived in Jacksonville or Daytona Beach. That's all nice and sweet and cute. But they believed that our reality was as human beings of the universe because we were created divinely by a God who controlled the universe. So we're talking about the divine or sacred world, the cosmos or the universe. So that's cosmos is everything out there. What if we considered ourselves not just regular human beings or Negroes on the corner, and that we were divinely created and were citizens of the entire universe or cosmos? Boy, that's a high distinction to have that, which will cause us not to do or say some of the things. State or governance, the society of the human community, that's humanity. So we're not just living our neighborhood, we're part of a human community of created beings. And finally, the human being, which is not an individual, it's a family. Okay, next. Each reality has 5 dimensions: religious, cosmic, political, social, and anthropological. So those are each reality, and religious has to do with your spiritual practices. Cosmic, that refers to university. Political, probably not the political we're talking about today, but being a part of a village or a system of governance in which there are leaders and elders and people with distinct roles to nurture and to educate everyone to become the best possible person they can be. So that's the social part, and there's anthropological. Okay, next. Behavioral manifestations, and this was really good. I operationalized this too in order to get, especially the teenagers that I work with, to get them an idea of where they fit and how they can change it. So there's authentic behavior that we see. There used to be a big issue about being authentic and not being phony. I'm not sure if that applies. Adaptive behavior, consistent with the culture and has been modified in response. Africans had to adapt to this culture that was an aberrant culture that treated them as if they were not human beings. And they had to adapt to murder, rape, assault, disrespect. And they actually did a very good job, considering it could have been a lot worse. Then there's adopted behavior, uncritically borrowed from another culture. We see all these people crossing over, trying to be somebody they're not. And it creates a disconnect with who you are when you try to be somebody that you're not. And that disconnect is one of the things that causes some of the type of aberrant behavior and the mental illness and emotional and social problems we're having. Then there's aberrant behavior, antithetical to the culture, and if not corrected, result distortion, destruction. We're seeing some of the aftermath of that with some of our folks, young people, older people, society as general. We're seeing the effect of aberrant behavior, where people are doing terrible things, anything that leads to destruction. Next. Okay, I know I've been covering this very fast, and I hope I forgot to bestow y'all with fast learning skills before I started, so I apologize for that. Recommendation clinical strategies. Okay, I've given you a lot of information, the background of the MIAFA, and all the negative things that happen. And I gave you the Trust which is going to give you a lot to work with. There's a lot of readings. I've got a small bibliography. I'll send another one. I've got hundreds of books. I'm going to send my Journals of Black Psychology to Dr. Haller. I'm getting them together. I got probably several hundred of them. I'm going to donate them to your psychology department. But this is the recommendation to clinical strategies. Implement programs or partner with programs in cultural ethnic communities, such as respected institutions, HBCUs, churches, community groups, community organizations. We don't do enough partnering and working with each other. People are territorial and they want to protect their funding sources. We got to change that. Implement programs or support current programs that improve the number of so-called minority behavioral health care providers. We need more competent minority healthcare providers. That's why all of you are studying psychology, so you can be the soldiers out there as I travel and take it easy and work when I feel like it. Provide programs or support existing programs that increase the level of awareness of the value of behavioral health professionals in the community. A lot of our folks are very suspect of mental health and behavioral health. I attended a community program a few weeks ago sponsored by AKA chapter, and it was a big event. They had mammograms, COVID testing, vaccinations, they had free food, they had two panels. The first panel were African-American doctors who gave all the facts regarding COVID, dispelling the myths, urging people to be vaccinated. I was on the second panel, which looked at the emotional and psychological impact of COVID. They told me I was the expert psychologist on it. You know what an expert is? X is a has been and the spurt is a little drip. But it was very emotional to hear folks talk about their experiences. And fortunately, the two people on my panel with me, they end up um, having COVID, recovered from it, all getting mental health. Let me see. Okay, next. I'm trying to expedite this. Increase the level of sensitivity to the cultural differences of all people served and the need to provide culturally proficient staff. I used to say, you didn't use proficient. I made it sound like you could make people culturally experts. You can. People could be proficient and understand their differences and work to bridge those differences. Review current evaluation, assessment, screening, and testing tools to ensure cultural fairness, competence, and proficiency. That's a big, big issue with so-called minorities, African Americans, Latinos, and other marginalized groups. Develop public awareness and education in order to reduce the stigma associated with mental health and behavioral health treatment. Okay, next. Okay, I'm ending with this. This is from Dr. Asa Hilliard's book, SBA, The Reawakening of the African Mind in 1998. And he's gone from psychologist to ancestor. I had the pleasure of knowing him personally. He autographed all the books I bought. This is what the foreword in his book by Dr. Wade Nobles. The Reawakening of the African Mind, 1998. Dr. Wade Nobles stated, as professionals in service to our people, we must engage in a deep, profound, and penetrating search, study, understanding, and mastery of the illumination of the African spirit in our time and place. In effect, the work should, number one, draw upon a source of energy and understanding that would ignite and enhance the spiritual, mental, and physical well-being of African people. Two, reflect and protect the human integrity of African people. Three, serve as a guide toward the future growth and development of the humanity of African people. Four, serve as the stimulus for and evidence of the illumination of the African spirit. And five, work to guarantee African liberation, intellectual enlightenment, and ongoing human advancement. Next. Okay, that's me, that's my contact information. Where I still have limited practice. That concludes my presentation. I appreciate y'all inviting me, a poor country boy from Green Cove Springs, to present at your prestigious university. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richardson. Next, we have Mr. Hill with Our Children Has Rights.
Thank you for having me. Once again, my name is Greg Hill, and I started a nonprofit organization whose title is Our Children Have Rights.org, and the mission of Our Children Have Rights.org is to protect children's right to have access to both parents equally by providing resources. So I know there is a hot topic of suicide and a lot of social issues and a lot of issues that are going on in our community. So I wanted to make sure that I let everyone know that you are not alone, and just give you guys some ideas of some of the resources that we are actually providing to help you through this process. One of the things that we have three pillars, what we call them three pillars, and we call these pillars education pillar. The second one is a mental health pillar. The third is a legal aid and documentation review pillar. So I'll go over these pillars with you real briefly. I don't want to take up much of everybody's time. The first pillar, which is our main pillar, which is the one that I really like to get down into, is the education pillar. And I would like everyone to be educated on the process of protecting your child's right to have access to you. The main thing that we try to provide or try to inform everyone in our community when it comes to protecting your children's right is the three things, especially the state of Florida likes to use to determine detriment to children. One is the distance from the child. So the state of Florida states that if you are more than 45 miles away from your children or from the child, you live more than 45 minutes away from the child as the non-custodial parent, they want to put you in what is called a long distance plan, which is why you hear most parents or most non-custodial parents complain or, have issues with only seeing children every other weekend, every month. And it's because of the actual process or the actual cookie cutter plan that the state of Florida actually puts our parents in when they put you into this process. So the first thing you want to do to combat that is to, if you can, live within 45 miles of your child. And if you can do that, then you have a better chance of getting what a lot of parents want will be those 50-50 rights to the child. And that is what we explain when we break down the education pillar. The second part of our education pillar is we want our parents to look accountable or be presented as accountable parents inside the courtroom. So one way to do that is to put the child on your insurance. If you have the child on your insurance, you live within 45 miles of the child, you have a greater chance of having more parenting time with the child. The third one is fight for the overnights. So the state of Florida, if you look at a child support calculator, you will look at those three things: the distance, the overnights, and the insurance. And if you have these things in your favor, you have a much greater opportunity to have more parenting time, or the child has more access to you as their parent. And I'm bringing this up because suicide and social issues and mental health issues are an all-time high because, or due to a lot of the plans or a lot of parents not being able to have access to their children. That goes into the psychology, that goes into everything that, a lot of you students are studying when it comes to psychology class. A lot of this is brought on because these parents are lacking the actual access to their children. And so that leads us into our mental health pillar. So in our mental health, what we're trying to do is make sure that our parents are at a good homeostasis when they are going into the courtroom to protect their children, like to have access to them. We want our parents to avoid fighting the other parent and be able to hold the actual judge accountable. So we do that by a few of our actual programs or processes in our mental health pillar. So yes, we have clinical psychologists that could actually access any parent, any state in the country at this point in time. We are servicing all 50 states. So you can reach out and have someone to speak to about what you're going through with your actual process. And then we also have, we have an actual part of our actual process where we deal with a lot of clinical issues. We also deal with, if you have a substance abuse problem issue, a lot of these things are what the judge may order for you to actually have resolved before you actually have access to that child. And the judge is using it as a detriment to the child. So we have programs to take care of those and relieve those in the judge's eyes as well. And so that covers our mental health. And so the third one is our actual documentation review and our legal aid. So with our documentation review, a lot of our parents already have parenting plans, or they have documentation that may be being used against them as detriment. So we want to review that documentation, go over it with our parents, and then make sure our parents understand what the actual courts are saying that is needed for you to do to gain the access to the child, or the child to have access to you that you're actually requesting or requiring. And so once we go through that process and look at your documentation, we put plans together for our parents to make sure that they have the access that they need. So now you know how to hold the courts accountable when you go into the courtroom with the information from the actual court order or the documentation that you need to go into the courtroom. So again, we have three pillars. The first one is education. So we want to make sure our parents are educated on the process of protecting their children's right to have access to them. Second one is the mental health. We want to make sure that you are at your best home space, and you are not fighting when you're going to the courtroom. So you have stable mind when you're going to the courtroom to protect your children to have access to you. And the third is the documentation review. So now we have you educated, your mind is right, your documentation is right. The actual other piece that we have on the legal aid pillar is the actual legal aid assistance. So what we're doing with legal aid assistance is we are actually helping you find a lawyer. You can find your own lawyer if you need representation into the courtroom. And then with that lawyer, we want to pay your retainer fees in the courtroom for the lawyers to actually help represent you in court. So we want to educate you. We want you to have your mind right when you go in. We want your documentation to be together, and we want the representation that you need going into the courtroom to protect your child's right to have access to you. So that is what we are doing here with Children Have Rights. Let me see, what else can we cover? So a lot of this is really about accountability. That's all we're really trying to help our parents do, is be accountable for their children. That's one of our best abilities. That is your best ability as a parent, is to be accountable for your child. So if we can help you with that accountability, then that's what we actually want to help you obtain coming into that process. So let me cover this for a lot of us, because I mean, of course, we want to help the young men and women with their process, and we want to help you understand what you need to protect your child right to have access to. Understand this. Let me talk to the fathers real quick. I'll get directly to the fathers. Fathers, you have no rights to your children until you return, until you establish the documentation that you need to protect your child's right to have access to you. Now, let's an education point at this point in time. Look up or have some access to what is called a VDOP. I want all parents to write that down. VDOP. That is a voluntary declaration of parentage. In the state of Florida, at the hospital, you want to ask for a voluntary declaration of parentage if you are having a child. And with that voluntary declaration of parentage, that automatically establishes the child's right to have access to you. Now, you still have to go and petition the courts and establish a parenting plan, but you already have rights to the child once you sign a VDOP at the hospital. So that is imperative that our fathers understand or have that knowledge of that documentation. And so sometimes before you sign the VDOP, you want to make sure you have a paternity test. So you should be able to ask for a paternity test at the hospital. And if you're denied at the hospital, then you can have it court ordered. That documentation along with your VDOP now establishes that you are father through the court's eyes. And now you have an easier process to go ahead and take care of your child rights to get the actual parenting plan. So education for our Black fathers especially, I want you to hear me clearly. You don't want to go through the child support agency, because if you go through the child support agency, they cannot equivalent, they cannot add in the actual overnights for your child. They cannot add in the actual insurance for your child. And so therefore you are kind of diminishing the actual financials that you would have to pay if you do these things. So you want to make sure that you are educated in your state on the process of protecting your child's right to have access to you. So now this goes into the psychology of it, because I mean, suicide is at an all-time high. We want to make sure that these children are protected, because it actually starts at home. We want to protect these because the children need both parents equally. Studies show that when the child has access to both parents equally, the child is more likely to graduate high school. The child is less likely to have behavioral problems. The child is more likely to graduate college. So all these things are a direct correlation to the children having access to both parents equally. And that's what we are doing here with our Children Have Rights. I don't want to take up too much of everybody's time. Not everybody else has, they have excellent presentations, but I just wanted to come on and let you all know that there are resources out here. We are here to help. We are here with you. You are not alone. We have the pillars that can help you. If you ever need to reach out, you can reach out to us at ochr.org. That is a website that we've established, so there's a lot of information there on with the book that we've written. You can actually reach out there and get directly to us to have help protecting your children's right to have access to you equally. Our children have rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. That generated a lot of questions, and I hope everyone sticks around at the end where we'll have Dr. Richardson and all of our guests answer those questions. And so just to recap, our keynote speaker was talking about the importance of your history, identity, and culture in your mental well-being, right? And that is a protective factor. Mr. Hill was talking about some issues that are risk factors in the Black community that circle around family. As we all know, family is very important in the Black community. It's one of the high values that we ascribe to. And oftentimes it is the point of contention of or point of distress for a lot of us as well. Mr. Hill talked about how it increases or leads to increases in suicide ideation and attempts. I'll be going into that a little bit later, tying in what Dr. Richardson was saying, as well as what Mr. Hill was talking about. But for our next speaker, Samantha, if you mind reading the bio and introducing our next speaker, please.
Of course. Thank you so much, Mr. Hill, for this informative patent and his students, which will be making a presentation on human sexuality. A little bit about Dr. Payton is he has earned the rank of full professor with tenure since 2008 at Bethune-Cookman University and has been employed by the university for 30 years as both a professor and former dean of the School of Social Sciences. His interests and area of specialization are in abnormal counseling and educational psychology. As part of his academic responsibility, the supervision of field placement and the facilitation of the final senior research paper are both integral in his department obligation. With the advent of the online teaching modalities at BCU since the early 1990s, he has been an integral member of the design and implementation of online instruction. As part of his tenure at Bethune-Cookman University, he is the recipient of both Fulbright postdoctoral fellowship in South Asia and the DuPont Fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill. Prior to his employment in higher education, he was engaged in private psychological practices in an employee assistant program in both Colorado. And we have Dr. Ian Payton.
Thank you, Samantha. First of all, go Wildcats, right?
Go Wildcats.
Yeah, we have a lot of
Go Wildcats.
so we have to say go Wildcats, right? Just one of the guests here tonight is Chantel Colmer Thompson, one of my students from many, many years ago. Welcome to the symposium, Chantel. And of course, I've got some of my other students there as well. Welcome. And again, it's a unique opportunity to get all of our faculty together and outside individuals to present this symposium. My presentation is on one of my classes that I teach at Cookman, which is human sexuality. It's a 400 level class, and we discuss a lot of theoretical premises to human sexuality, but we also try to have students recognize some of the issues that they have personally, that they bring into their well-being and attitudes towards their own sexuality. So we see a lot of transformations in our students throughout the semester, and again, learning about the different aspects and issues in human sexuality. So my PowerPoint tonight deals with homophobia. It is not my PowerPoint. I've added some issues and concerns to the presentation, but one of my students put this one together, and I think it's apropos to our students at Bethune-Cookman University. We have a vast diversity, of course, at the university. And of course, in terms of our sexuality, we see the same aspects there. So what I'm going to do is share the screen right now and start the PowerPoint. I think my host has to give me permission to screen share. It's just telling me my host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, bear with me for 1 minute. Let me see.
Okay, gotcha. There's usually 3 dots on the top right. You make me the co-host, or you can do other things with it.
How about now? Are you able to share?
Yes, thank you. Got it. Thank you, Dr. Holler. Okay, everybody see the PowerPoint okay? Good. So my topic is on homophobia. Again, and a few of my students helped put this together. So, you know, as mentioned, I've been at Bethune-Cookman for 31 years now, and I've seen a lot of changes occur, not only in the physical aspects of the university, but also in terms of sexuality on campus. And we've had a broadening of those horizons over the years. So a lot of the topics that we talk about in human sexuality are very relevant to today's society. And one of the topics one of my students came up with, Ms. Brown, was called homophobia. And again, I think in the audience tonight, we have quite a few of my students in other classes, but also coming from this class as well. It's one of those classes that you gain a lot of academic, theoretical background, but also it enables us to take a long look at ourselves and how we come up with our attitudes and values pertaining to sexuality. So again, this one deals with homophobia. And of course, when we look at the history of homophobia, from those of you, Dr. Richardson, and probably the only one that can remember these times back in 1973, where the APA first had the diagnosable mental disorder of homosexuality as a psychological disorder. And I mentioned in 1973, they removed that particular diagnosis and did away with it. So no longer is homosexuality as of 1973, which is 40 odd years ago, considered to be a disorder anymore. The concept of homophobia can be traced way back to ancient Greece, where it was first considered common in their culture. And the term homophobia is a relatively new phrase, first introduced by the psychologist George Weinberg in the 1960s. So we take a look at what is homophobia. And as my student mentioned here, went into how we develop our negative attitudes towards homosexual individuals. And it's expressed usually at the individual, cultural, and institutional levels. And again, the term homophobia sounds like the fear of homosexuality. And it's indicative of aversion to others who belong to the gay community. So first, some definitions to enable us to understand certain things. Gay, lesbian. These are definitions: exclusive physical and, more importantly, emotional attraction to members of one's own sex. And then bisexual, meaning physical and emotional attraction to members of both sexes. And transgender, or what we call gender identity, and of course, people in abnormal psychology know that as gender identity disorder, in which we have a problem with our gender not lining up with our biological beingness. So a person feels his or her body is not the sex it should be, regardless of transformational hormone or surgical status. And cisgender, a person whose gender identity matches their sex at birth. So it's interesting to look at some of the prevalence rates. 9 million LGBTQ people in the US. There are 320 million in the US presently. Homosexual, gay/lesbian, is the preferred term. 3.4% self-identify as LGBT. 1 in 5, or 20.8% of males in the US reported either homosexual behavior or homosexual attraction since age 15. That's 20%. 17% of women and 6% of men have engaged in same-sex behavior. However, only 7% of women and 4% of men identify as gay or bisexual. So these are interesting statistics in terms of actual numbers in the LGBT population. What causes homophobia? For some people, there may be one clear cause, such as their religious background. Others may not be aware of what has caused their homophobia. Certain religions teach that homosexual behavior or attraction is immoral or a sin. And there are 3 types of homophobia: internalized homophobia, interpersonal homophobia, and institutional homophobia. So when we look at internalized homophobia, we look at how it refers to homophobia that is directed inwardly at yourself. This type of homophobia can arise from a few different situations and can be the most self-destructive from an internalized standpoint. As an example, a person raised in a family in which homosexuality was not accepted for religious reasons might choose to ignore their preference and instead live a life as a heterosexual individual. The second modality is called interpersonal homophobia. And this refers to homophobia that takes place between individuals. People who engage in interpersonal homophobia do so based on prejudices that they hold with regard to sexual orientation that result in them experiencing feelings of discomfort or dislike for individuals. As an example, a person may experience being shunned by a particular relative when that person learns of their sexual orientation. And the third type mentioned is institutional homophobia. And that refers to homophobia that originates within institutions, organizations, governments, and businesses. This type of homophobia generally leads to discrimination through the enforcement of policies, allocation of resources, and protection of rights that put individuals with a non-heterosexual orientation at a disadvantage. What are the signs of homophobia? People use religion or condemn the LGBTQ community. People are against things such as the gay pride parades. and people who don't acknowledge homophobic behavior. So one of the issues that obviously our students experience during these holidays, as is mentioned, and specifically with individuals with these with orientations, the prevalence of 17.2% is higher in the gay, lesbian communities, and that is higher than the US adult men in general. So again, depression rates obviously are higher for those with homosexual or gay types of orientation. Distress and depression are associated with, number one, lack of a partner, not coming out or identifying as gay, queer, or homosexual, experiencing multiple episodes of anti-gay violence in the previous 5 years, and very high levels of community alienation. So almost 10% of LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, two-spirited, queer, or questioning students heard homophobic comments from teachers daily or weekly. The report found that close to 10% of straight students have experienced homophobic insults and physical harassment because of perceptions about their sexual orientation. 58% of straight students find homophobic comments upsetting. So when we look at LGBT youth victimization, 25% of gay youth, 16% of lesbian have been threatened or injured with a weapon on school property, 3 times higher than hetero rate for boys, 4 times higher than hetero for girls. 13% gay, 16% lesbian youth didn't go to school because of safety issues, 3 times the hetero rate. How can an LGBT person know if someone is safe to talk to? Go with your instincts. And these are some of the symbols that are obviously out there in the community to make it safe for people to discuss and communicate about issues. I want to close with, it's a short video, and I think it takes a look at some of the issues that we're dealing with, not only in the gay, lesbian community, but also in what we call marginalized cultures and situations. It's a TED Talk, and hopefully everybody can see this all right.
Dr. Payton, before you begin, I just want to remind you to make sure you share your audio.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's down at the bottom. Is that correct?
Yes, it should be. I think the little arrow by your share screen might bring it up, or the more, actually the 3 dots that say more might bring it up for you, where it says share screen audio.
All right, very good. Thank you. Give me a second here.
I learned to be ashamed of myself at a very early age. I kissed one of my kindergarten guy friends, and it was innocent as most things are when you're—
Can you hear it, Dr. Holler?
We can hear, but we can't see it. You're going to have to reshare the new screen that you're showing us.
Gotcha.
Remember when our boss was cooking all
5.
While
I'd
he's
seen
doing that, I'd like to remind you all to please keep your microphones on mute.
husband and wives. But when they all—
Is that working
it
now,
was
Dr. Holler?
innocent as most things are when you're 5. I'd seen husband and wives kiss. I'd seen kids kiss, mimicking husband and wives. But when they all burst out with, "Ooh, I'm telling," and "You're nasty," I knew I'd done something wrong. I didn't know why. I just knew it was wrong. We are born into pre-existing social norms, many of which we have no control over. Some of them are great ways of living, while others, not so much. We're taught to be hateful, discriminatory, prejudiced, homophobic, sexist, and the list could go on. We allow these norms to control how we live, act, and treat other people, even when we find evidence to the contrary. For 29 years, I lived my life as a straight male, knowing full well I was gay. I had adopted a narrative that was ingrained in me since I was a child, and that was boys don't kiss boys. I allowed other people's opinions about homosexuality to control my life and even dictate how I treated other gay people. In 2013, I joined a small team to co-found Be Me Community, a national network of community builders that are dedicated to building more caring and prosperous communities. Our work is based on Trabian's research in asset framing, and together we forged a brotherhood of Black men who have committed their lives to the public good. And with asset framing, we focus on people's assets and not their deficits. I got a chance to travel the country and tell everybody, be yourself, be who you are, love yourself, when all the while, I wasn't being my authentic self. So in 2015, I broke the internet with a national article entitled, "I'm Black, I'm a Minister, and I'm Gay." 4 million, thank you. Thank you. I wish I had you all the night it was released. 4 million views, hundreds of thousands of shares, tons of comments, many not worth repeating, all filled the internet. On that day, that very life-altering day, hundreds of thousands of people judged me that had never met me, never experienced my smile, never experienced my big boisterous laugh, never sat with me the many nights that I cried and prayed and toiled and pleaded with God to take this sin away. But in the work that I do, I realize that their response to my vulnerability and their desire to fix me or save me is no different than many of our approaches who desire to make the world a better place. It's all based on one simple yet powerful mechanism: narrative. The story you tell becomes the life that you live. Everybody walks around with prescripted narratives about everything. We live, act, and are because of stories that are told to us, whether it's by family, friends, the church, the media. We treat people and deal with each other based on narrative. Here are some narratives that are popular right now that are just no good for the future of our country and, quite frankly, are just not true. My religion is better than your religion. Women want privileges they haven't earned. The poor are a burden on society. Black youth must be neutralized in order for America to prosper. An advantage for them is a disadvantage for me. Let me provide you some narrative with fact behind it. The narrative: Muslims are a threat to America's safety. The fact: there are over 3 million Muslim Americans who practice Islam, and you're far more likely to be injured by a slice of pizza than a Muslim. Roughly 2,300 Americans were rushed to the hospital last year for pizza-related injuries. The narrative: immigrants, Mexicans are rapists and thugs. The fact: immigrants are far less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. In fact, they contribute billions to the economy and are far more likely to start their own business. The narrative: people become homosexual because they've been abused or molested as children. The fact: the American Psychiatric Association said there is no greater prevalency of abuse amongst children who grow up and identify as heterosexual versus children that grow up and identify as homosexual. The narrative: Trayvon Martin should not have been walking in that neighborhood. The fact: Trayvon lived in that neighborhood and posed no threat. And George Zimmerman was told by the 911 operator not to follow him, but he did. Now, I know a lot of this is getting heavy, but there's good news that we have a very high chance of abandoning these narratives. And if you hadn't noticed, most of these narratives are about Black and brown people. And in order for our country to prosper, Black and brown people need to prosper because guess what? In 20 years, we will be the majority. It is imperative that we build an America for all if we want to be in America for long. Now, Be Me Community stands on 4 principles. We value all members of the human family. We present Black people as assets to society. We reject narratives that denigrate and pit one group against the other. And we work with everyone to build more caring and prosperous communities. When we first formed, we asked hundreds of Black men what they're working on, and they told us the issues that they are working on and will continue to work on whether we help them out or not. And in order of frequency, they were youth development, education, economic opportunity, public safety, and a healthier environment. Now, which one of those issues is exclusive to the Black community? None. We all care about the same things. So why is there still so much division? Why haven't we come together? We believe it's because we've been psychologically indoctrinated into the practice of denigration and division. And let me show you how. I'll ask you a question, and only if your response is yes or if you agree will you respond to what I ask you to do. We got it? Here we go. If you heard or know that Black and brown youth drop out of high school at high rates, clap once. If you heard or know that there's a high rate of poverty in Black families, clap twice. If you heard or know how many Black and brown folks are either in college or actually have degrees, clap once. If you know how many Black families are millionaires, give me a big resounding round of applause. Okay. What I was trying to simply point out is that when it comes to the stories of people's deficit and the negatives, we who are in this room, the good guys, are well equipped to tell the stories of their demise and their deficits. But when it comes to stories of their contributions to this country, we're empty-handed. In order for us to progress, we're going to have to start shifting narratives, starting with our own. Look at your neighbor. Look him right in the eye, and I want you to sit for a moment and think about everything that is wrong about that person. Now, I want you to tell him. Okay, don't do it. When we do this, we get laughs, gas, people turn red, people are surprised. Why? Because it's not right, and it's not fair. So how come when we think about our young people, when we think about our Black and brown communities, the first thing we do is to define them by their greatest struggle, their greatest weakness, and their deficit? Now, I know we're all well-meaning folks, and I know we all want to build great and prosperous communities, and we want to help people be their best selves, so I know we don't do this intentionally. It's because we've been indoctrinated that we naturally look for the problem and try to fix it. But what we need to be intentional about is looking at assets and aspirations and inspirations so that when we come to the table, we have a fuller picture to bring solutions to the table. We at Be Me do not present Black men as deficits. We look at their assets. And once you define someone by their challenge, you've stigmatized them. And once you stigmatize them, you're prone to ignore their contributions and focus on their deficits and then consider their deficit the norm. Many people think a lot of Black families are poor when in fact the majority of Black families are in the middle class and working. Many people think Black children come from broken homes and fatherless homes when in fact Black dads take care of their children more than any other racial group in the entire country, and that's by a study by the Centers for Disease Control. We need to focus on assets. We need to focus on people's contributions. We need to stop trying to fix people. People are not the problem. People are the solution. You were embarrassed a few moments ago when I asked you to judge your neighbor by their deficit or what's wrong with them. Why? Because it's not right. It's not fair. So let's stop doing it to groups of people we don't even know. Let's reject narratives that denigrate and engender division and focus on deficits. For the sake of our own survival, we need to start telling a better story, a different story about America's future. And that starts first by us telling the truth about one another. Now more than ever, we need to lead the charge in valuing all members of the human family, make asset framing our new social norm, and work together so that all Americans, Black, white, gay, straight, rich, or poor, can come together and build a more caring and prosperous nation, a more caring and prosperous world. Thank you so much.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. I hope you appreciated our class, Human Sexuality. And again, thank all students and all professionals and all community members for being here this evening. And thank you. Yep. Must be Christmas time.
I was on a long road trip this summer, and I was having a wonderful time listening to the amazing.
All right, there you go. Thank you, Dr. Payton. That also generated a lot of questions. Hopefully, everyone will stick around for the Q&A session. Let's go ahead and move forward. Samantha.
Again, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Dr. Payton. Our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Holler with a presentation on techniques and approaches to mental wellness. A little bit about Dr. Holler. He is assistant professor of psychology and has a breadth of experiences with law enforcement agencies and personnel. For over 12 years, he worked alongside law enforcement professionals at the largest forensic psychiatric inpatient hospital in Florida, providing individual and group therapy, competency evaluation and training, as well as mental status evaluation for involuntary commitment, and has provided expert testimonies in the state of Florida. Dr. Holler has done work for the Department of Juvenile Justice and the Department of Children and Family for over a decade. Additionally, he has 50 years of psychological assessment experience in private practice, with an expertise in suicide risk assessment. Dr. Holler has taught undergrad and graduate students and currently serves as Department Chair of Psychology at Bethune-Cookman University. He has co-authored more than 10 publications in peer-reviewed scientific journals, authored a book chapter on mental health treatment for diverse populations, and authored a book on suicide and eating disorder behavior. Dr. Holler completed his PhD in clinical psychology from Florida State University.
Okay, thank you, Samantha. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so just a little more details about what I'm going to discuss today. I'm going to talk about the science of suicide. We've been mentioning it today in pretty much each of our presentations. Even among the LGBTQ community, suicide is at a high rate. So I'm going to talk about what are some of the science behind it, what are the causes of it, risk factors, and I'm trying to tie in together some of the things that our keynote speaker mentioned, as well as our other presenters. So again, we'll talk about why mental health matters. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between stress versus trauma and PTSD, because we often use those terms inaccurately. Then I'm going to talk about some of the mental health factors specific for African Americans to be aware of. And then I'll go into the science of suicide and some solutions to reduce risk. I'll probably speed through this because I want to make sure our last presenter has time and that we have time for the Q&A. All right, so mental health matters. We all know that without our mental health, we can't be healthy. Any part of the body, including the brain, can become ill, right? And so mental health conditions are medical conditions that can alter your life because they make it hard to relate to others and to function. They cause distress and impairment in our everyday life. And without attending to these issues, without proper treatment, we can become even worse. So what is stress versus trauma? Stress is a state or a state of mental or emotional strain, right? It's caused by psychosocial distressors, such as, you know, if your parents got divorced, that caused a lot of stress for individuals, right? But that's not considered a trauma, right? A trauma is an emotional or behavioral response to a terrible, life-threatening event, right? It causes unpredictable emotions, recurrent intrusive thoughts and behaviors, flashbacks, nightmares, and strains our relationships with others. Okay, it can even cause physical symptoms like a racing heart, sweaty palms, etc. In order to be traumatized or have a history of trauma, you have to have had an actual or threatened death or serious injury to your person, right? That's according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which we use to diagnose mental illness. I want to talk a little bit about violence and trauma in the Black community. So some of this information, I had the pleasure to sit in one of Dr. Richardson's presentations in the past, and also do some research where he went into a depth about suicide in the Black community. Oh, I'm sorry, about violence and trauma in the Black community. But just some tidbits for you all. Black youth are 3 times more likely to be victims of a robbery and 5 times more likely to be victims of homicide. Homicide is the leading cause of death for African-American youth ages 15 to 24. That's important because that's going to come into play when we talk about suicide. That's actually a group that is highly at risk for suicide as well. Young Black men ages 15 to 24. Also, living in an urban environment increases the risk of exposure to violence. 25% of low-income urban youth have witnessed a murder. So what are we talking about? We're talking about people who live in the inner city, in the Black communities, right? They tend to be to have lots of violence in the community because violence is associated with poverty, not with race, okay? So because Black people in America tend to live in impoverished environments, there also tends to be a prevalence of violence in those communities. In one study of 7-year-olds, 75% had heard a gunshot, 60% had seen drug deals, 18% had seen a dead body outside. If you remember that movie, Boys in the Hood, where they said, hey, you want to see a dead body in the beginning of the movie in South Central LA? Well, those types of situations are true. That young Black youth go through those situations and have witnessed a lot of trauma and violence in their communities. 10% have witnessed of stabbing at home. We talked earlier about domestic violence issues related to the court and how parents often go to court to fight for custody of their children. Oftentimes, before the divorce, there was some situations of domestic violence or trauma in the home. So again, trauma and PTSD. According to the DSM-5, the criteria, there are 5 criteria. You have to be directly or indirectly exposed to death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So we mean like if you were in a hurricane, a tornado, or a natural disaster, that will count. If you were in a serious car accident where you almost died or a person died in that car accident, we're talking about that. Sexual assault counts. And also if someone in your family close to you died unexpectedly, like you weren't expecting them to die, they didn't die because of old age or because they had a chronic illness and you knew it was coming, but they died suddenly, like under situations related to COVID this past year or two, right? People in our families may have died suddenly because they got diagnosed with COVID and they didn't recover. There also has to be intrusive symptoms like thoughts and flashbacks, thinking about the traumatic event, even when you're not trying to, persistent avoidance of situations that trigger memories related to the trauma, negative thoughts and mood, and also alterations in arousal and reactivity. So you become real fidgety. Your startle reaction is increased, so you're very fidgety and jumpy at the slightest noise or sound, right? Some of the symptoms, again, self-destructive or reckless behavior, recurring thoughts or intrusive memories like nightmares, flashbacks, also feelings of distress, hypervigilance, always looking for a threat, even when there's not one present, as well as problems thinking and with concentration, being irritable and aggressive. So these are some signs of trauma and PTSD. So how do mental health conditions affect the African-American community, right? That's my area of expertise. I study mental health issues specifically among Black Americans. Well, we see that major depression is the most common form of mental health problems. It's most prevalent in women, and that's true of the general population as well. ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, tends to be highly diagnosed among young Black males, right? There is some research that indicates that it may be overdiagnosed in Black children because they have a different learning style than is common in Western educational systems. Suicide among young African-American men has gone through the roof, and I'm going to talk about that again a little later. And PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, tends to be prevalent, again, because African-Americans are more likely to live in impoverished environments, and impoverished environments are likely to have high incidences of crime and violence. So there was a study that came out earlier this year that looked at temporal trends in suicidal ideation and attempts among youth or children by sex, race, and ethnicity. So while rates of suicide, ideation, and anxiety have risen sharply during the pandemic this past year or two, a new study found that suicide attempts, particularly among our youth, have been rising at an alarming rate long before COVID-19. Researchers from Indiana and Purdue University surveyed about 183 or 184,000 school-aged children in high school from 1991 to 2019 in the United States. The survey was given twice a year and asked 3 questions about suicide ideation, suicide plans, and attempts. And so the main thing I want to bring your attention to is that while suicide rates were generally decreasing for most ethnic groups, we see here after about 2007, you see an increase among Blacks, right? As well as an increase later on for other individuals. And we're going to talk about this rate of increase because the rate of increase among African Americans is much higher. Again, you see suicide attempts. This gold yellowish line is African Americans. You see suicide attempts for African Americans are going up, while for other groups, the trend is to go down. So while other racial groups and ethnic groups are decreasing, we see a general trend over here in suicide attempts going up for African Americans. So teenagers attempt suicide, or teenagers who have attempted suicide has increased 22% over nearly 3 decades, so over the last 30 years, but the trend varies depending on your sex and race. Black males had the highest increase of suicide attempts compared to any other race in the group. For example, increasing nearly 80%, right? Other female groups had this upward trend too. More white women attempted suicide from 2009 to 2019 in this example. And suicide ideation also increased for white, Black, and Hispanic women in general, right? So why do people die by suicide, right? That's what I went to graduate school for, my doctoral program. I studied suicide from one of the leading investigators on suicide risk assessment and prevention. His name is Dr. Thomas Joyner. I'm going to show you a little bit, maybe about 4 minutes of this video. It's from the Dr. Phil show. If you're familiar, Dr. Phil's a psychologist that had a TV show in Chicago, I believe. He was Oprah Winfrey's psychologist, and then she gave him a show. So let's watch what Dr. Joyner says are the risk factors that lead someone to die by suicide. And think about how those might apply to you or people you know in your community. Let me make sure my audio is shared.
Now joining us at this point.
Dr. Flood, could you guys hear my audio?
Yes, I can hear it and I can see the screen.
Okay, great. Here we go. Okay, try it again.
Now joining us at this point is Dr. Thomas Joyner, a distinguished research professor in the Department of Psychology at Florida State University. Now, he's written a book called Why People Die by Suicide. Let me say that again, and there's a picture of it up. Why People Die by Suicide. It's not a beach read, I understand, but it is an important, important message. Now, sadly, Dr. Joyner's own father committed suicide 18 years ago. Now, this really moved you to try to figure out how somebody with such a great and productive mind could get in such a dark place as to end their life.
That's right. My dad's death makes me feel honor bound to not
Looks like someone came in the room and it caused a little glitch with the video.
Now joining an important message. Now, sadly, Dr. Joyner's own father committed suicide 18 years ago. Now, this really moved you to try to figure out how somebody with such a great and productive mind could get in such a dark place as to end their life.
That's right. My dad's death makes me feel.
Try it one more time.
Now joining
Death makes me feel honor bound to not only understand it, but to exact some revenge for it. Something or somebody stole my dad away from me is the way I view it. And so I feel honor bound to return that favor and exact revenge. Here it's going to be exacting revenge on suicide itself by studying it scientifically, by advocacy, and through clinical and prevention work.
Yeah, and so by helping people understand it, know the warning signs, see what's going on, then we're raising awareness just by having this conversation.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what these wonderful people are doing down here, because at this point you say that Casey really wanted to make a difference in this world, and you can't just now sit back and not do something given the experience, true?
Yeah, exactly. I had a lot of the same pain that I think Mr. and Mrs. Brooks expressed, and that pain was strong for a while, but it did lessen. And then after it did, I poured my professional energies into trying to combat this international killer.
And you've made some headway. You figured something out. Dr. Joyner believes that people considering suicide share three traits in a very common way. And the first one is feeling like a burden on other people and that their death will be worth more than their life. Talk about that.
That's right. It's the idea, the mental calculation that my death will be worth more than my life. If you truly believe that, you could see how that would facilitate suicidal behavior. And we've shown in multiple studies that it does indeed do that. Crucially, the person is mistaken in that perception. But the trick is that they don't know that they're mistaken in that perception. They believe it to be true, and it spurs suicidal behavior.
And isn't it true that most suicidal situations and dilemmas that push people over the edge are transient? That if they had just stuck it out, they tend to get better?
Absolutely. There's no question about that. And there's also no question, as you've already alluded to, that there are good, effective treatments that work for the conditions that underlie suicidal behavior.
Yeah. Psychologically, therapeutically, pharmacologically, there are so many things that can give people relief.
Absolutely.
The second common trait that Dr. Joyner talks about is a feeling of loneliness or social disconnection.
If you look through the literature, the scientific literature on suicidal behavior, arguably the single most powerful risk factor of all is loneliness, a feeling of alienation from others.
Yeah, so they just don't feel like they fit, belong, so they're just on the outside looking in, so why not just leave?
That's right.
All right, and the third thing is an interesting thing that he talks about called fearlessness regarding pain, injury, and death. People considering suicide have learned to overcome these natural fears, and you say that that's more common than cowardice or that sort of thing.
That's right. I think it's a common misunderstanding to think of people who have died by suicide as cowardly or weak. That's just not accurate. And indeed, to do something as fearsome and as daunting as death by suicide, you do require a kind of fearlessness in order to carry through.
Yeah. When we come back, we're going to talk about the warning signs that tragically many parents overlooked. I've given you a list of those. We're going to have a little bit of discussion about them when we come back.
All right. So hopefully that gave you a little bit, understanding of suicide. Let's recap. So basically, Joyner's theory of suicide is called the interpersonal psychological theory of suicide, right? And it looks at three main factors. He talked about thwarted belongingness. So feeling like you need to belong or you want to belong to a group or community, but every time you try, you're being thwarted or something is stopping you or hindering you from feeling like you belong to a group. Then you have this perceived burdensomeness. So perceived burdensomeness is when you feel that or you think that you are so ineffective, you're such a burden to others around you that they would be better off if you were dead, if you weren't around, right? You feel like I don't contribute to the family or my peer group. Nothing I do is right. All I'm doing is causing problems for other people. Everyone will be better off if I just, took myself out of this situation, right? So that is a cognitive process, and that's a misperception that he talked about because every human life has value. Well, if you have these two factors, that leads to things like suicide ideation and maybe some attempts, right? But we want to know about, it leads to suicidal ideation, but we want to know about the people that actually go on to die by suicide. And those people have this third factor called acquired capability, or what Dr. Joyner referred to as fearlessness, right? The capability for suicide. Well, when we did research, what we found, this capability for suicide comes from repeated exposure or experience with pain, trauma, and violence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how these factors might relate to individuals in the African American community. So here we go with thwarted belongingness. Young Black men are treated as stronger and older, but don't have people to talk about their vulnerability. So often, if you are familiar with the research, children, young Black children are often viewed by their school teachers or people outside of the Black community as being older than they are or stronger, right? There's some literature about the magical Negro, right? About Black people who have, extraordinary strength or some type of ability, or the Superman or Superwoman syndrome, right? But these things are not true. They're myths because Black people are human beings just like everyone else is. We have strengths and weaknesses just like everyone else. These kind of thoughts, though, can lead to people not feeling like they belong as part of a group or being treated differently than other group members. Young Black men are often discriminated against in school and can be often perceived as older than they are, right? Perceived burdensomeness. This is feeling ineffective. Researchers at Indiana and Purdue University said that young Black men face financial hardships, among other stressors, and may have untreated mental health needs. So again, if we look at employment among youth, Black youth are at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to being able to find jobs in the community, all right? For Black males, for males and Black youths in particular, growing risks such as adverse childhood experiences, like we talked about, experience with domestic violence or pain, trauma, and violence in the community, systematic racism, discrimination. The Department of Health listed racism as a health emergency and concern for the nation. I'm not sure if you are aware of that. That was back in, I think, 2014. It was indicated as a national health concern. Neighborhood violence, we just talked about a little bit about the violence in impoverished communities, and then socioeconomic disparities need to be addressed in order to keep individuals from feeling like they don't contribute to society. The acquired capability or the role of trauma in suicide. So again, violence is the #1 killer of children between the ages of 15 to 24. African-American children were disproportionately represented among children who died by violence. Many social scientists agree that racial segregation, again, here's racism as being a problem, social isolation, drug and alcohol abuse, and media violence all contribute significantly to aggressive and violent behavior. Okay, so being exposed to violence on the internet, when we're looking at TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat, and those quick videos of people fighting, of even police violence, those things can vicariously traumatize individuals that watch them, especially individuals in our community that have more of a collective identity. Many young men of color suffer from Black self-hatred, which has resulted from years of conditioning in their social environment. So what we're talking about is as we assimilate and acculturate into Western American culture and values, that history begins with the enslavement of Africans. So the country is founded on racism. It's one of the pillars that you find in every institution in American society. And so that type of institutionalization of racism that we're exposed to as African Americans, if you assimilate those values and you don't have what Dr. Richardson was talking about, a strong African identity, cultural understanding, and practice of who you are, then you become at risk for those negative thoughts and beliefs that are in the larger society. And we'll just assimilate those thoughts about ourselves and think of ourselves as ineffective, as not competent, as not as smart as other people in the country. And that can create a feeling of self-hatred, right? Dr. Kobe Cambone, whose work I often reference and study, it's core to my research, talks about African self-fortification. And I'll talk a little bit about that as how that is a protective factor for Black males and individuals of African descent in general. So again, this acquired capability. Victimization levels increase as young people get older. Youth ages 12 to 24 suffer more violent crimes than any other age group. Again, that is also the age group that we see the increases in suicidality in the Black community. Over the course of their lifetime, 71% of 14 to 17-year-olds suffer an assault, 28% sexual victimization, 32% abuse or neglect, and 53% property victimization, like a crime in their community, their house was robbed, or there was a home invasion. Okay, so from these stats, I know that many of the people in our audience have experienced these things because this is the demographic that we serve at Bethune-Cookman University. Oftentimes, students have come to me and reported that they have been victims of assault during the school year. Okay, that's something that's not typical at other institutions, at predominantly white institutions. I've never experienced that as an instructor, but teaching at an HBCU, at Florida A&M University, and here at Cookman, I've experienced those situations where my students have talked to me about violence and crime that they have been victimized by. Black youth are also 3 times more likely to be victims of reported child abuse or neglect. Again, going back to what Mr. Hill was talking about in family court situations. So how do we incorporate our ethnicity, our history, what Dr. Richardson was talking about, the Ma'afa experience, how the enslavement of Africans is the foundation of this society that we live in? How do we incorporate all of that and our culture and faith into solutions? Okay. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is there's often a misunderstanding about mental health problems in the Black community. Many people in our community misunderstand what mental health conditions are, and they don't talk about this topic. They think it's a personal weakness. If you have a mental illness, you know, Black people, we don't talk about feeling depressed, right? Or anxious. We talk about being stressed or having some type of physical pain or headache, but we don't talk about I feel depressed or I feel anxious or I have a mental health problem, because we think of it as a personal weakness, right? These are some of the negative stigma about mental illness in our community. Oftentimes, people view it as a punishment from God. So our community tends to be very religious. And so when someone is suffering from a mental illness, it's not uncommon for people to tell them or for them to believe that they are being possessed by spirits or demons or things of that nature, right? And they think of it as being punished from God. They may say you need to pray more, you need to go to church more. But again, these are illnesses in the brain. Just like you have a physical illness like cancer, you might have breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, stomach cancer, HIV, AIDS, anything, any type of illness that you have, you would go to see a physician, right? You would pray, but you would also go see a physician. The same thing is true for mental illness. So we have to break this shame and stigma if we want to be well and take care of the people in our community. So faith, spirituality, and our community beliefs tend to be great sources of strength and support. So your faith and spirituality can help you in the recovery process. Spiritual practices can be a strong part of your treatment plan. We know from research that prayer actually improves the overall mental well-being of a person who prays, right? So spiritual practices like prayer and meditation help. Your spiritual leaders and your faith community can help and provide support and help reduce isolation or feeling like you don't belong. So you should talk to your pastors at church and let them know what you're experiencing, and hopefully they will redirect you to the proper places you can go to get treatment, like a psychiatrist or psychologist. But before you do that, a primary care doctor is a great place to start. Your primary care physician is a medical physician who's going to look at your physical body to see if you have anything physically going on that could cause these mental health symptoms. Like maybe you have a thyroid problem and that's causing you to have mood swings or to feel angry and depressed or irritable, right? Maybe you have some swelling of the brain that's causing you to hear voices or see things, and they got to treat the swelling of the brain. I often talk to my students about me having a diagnosis of systemic lupus. And the lupus I have is a medical condition, but it caused swelling of the brain. And so that caused me to be delusional and have magical beliefs and to hear voices and see things that other people can't. And the good thing was that my parents are both nurses, so they took me to a physician first instead of taking me to a mental health expert. And the physician was able to identify that I had systemic lupus. They were able to treat my physical illness and the mental health symptoms went away, right? But some people, they might actually have a mental health illness in the brain, and they may need psychotropic medication or clinical therapy to treat it. So part of my research, this is a book that I published where I looked at what is the relationship between culture and psychopathology. I saw some people asking these questions in the chat. Well, I looked at ethnic identification and cultural attitudes to see if they could predict someone's level of depression, anxiety, suicide, and eating disordered behavior like drive for thinness and body image dissatisfaction. So what I found basically was that low African self-fortification in men was a risk factor for depression, anxiety, suicide, and low value for African-centered relationships among women was a risk factor for depression, anxiety, and eating disordered behavior like body image dissatisfaction among Black women. So African self-fortification just refers to how deeply involved you are with your community, and the values that you ascribe to, if they relate, as they relate to being an African American. Value for African-centered relationships kind of refers to the value or emphasis that women place on their friendships with other Black women as opposed to women outside of their community. So Black women who had more value for women outside of their community tended to have body image dissatisfaction and a drive for thinness. That's essentially what I'm stating here. So what can you do to help yourself? Well, for suicide in particular, but this is also for any type of illness related to cultural misorientation. You can connect yourself to other Black conscious individuals in your community, right? Participate in a Black church, like an African Methodist Episcopal Church, or other religious or spiritual groups that are African-centered, where they value being Black and they celebrate being Black in African-American culture. You could also participate in a Black fraternal or sorority organization, attend an HBCU, or participate in a Black professional organization like the Association of Black Psychologists. This will help to increase your belongingness as well as your feelings of being effective at what you do. Connecting to Africans in the motherland. So being a Pan-Africanist, right? Going to Africa and the continent and building relationships with people there. I was able to do something like that in the Inyanyam project with Dr. Wade Nobles, who Dr. Richardson mentioned earlier today at his keynote, and with Dr. Naeem Akbar, who some of you have met when I brought him here to speak to our students. You can also join an African-centered movement, okay? And standing up to and fighting against racism is a protective factor against depression and anxiety for African Americans, because a lot of times the depression and anxiety we face, at the root of it is the experience of racism in this larger society, right? When you select a therapist, you want to make sure, like Dr. Richardson said, make sure you select a therapist who is culturally competent, right? Culturally competent means that that person understands Black people, has worked with Black people significantly, and has treated them successfully. Okay, and you can ask those questions. Have you treated other Blacks? Have you received training in cultural competence? How do you see our cultural background influencing our communication? It's all right for you to ask those questions to see if your mental health expert has the experience to treat you, or if they're willing to learn about your cultural background so that they can treat you effectively. And that includes your religion. If spirituality is important to you, you want to make sure that's a part of your treatment. Remember that there's always help available. You can call the 1-800 number, the National Suicide Prevention. It's 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255. If you're having suicidal thoughts or feeling depressed and you need someone to talk to and you want to talk anonymously, you can call that number. Also, if you're looking for a Black psychologist, because most times a culturally competent psychologist is going to be someone from your community, you can call the Association of Black Psychologists and ask them to help find you a therapist in your area. That number is 301-449-3082. There are also some resources that you can find online that can help you understand a little bit more about the risk factors related to suicide in the Black community. So I know that was very quickly, but I want to make time for Mr. George Ramsey, who's one of our counselors here at Cookman. So thank you all, and many thanks to the creator for our individual differences and collective strengths. Don't worry, we will still stay over for the question and answer session, but I understand if after 8 o'clock some of you have to go, that's quite all right. So Samantha, I'll go ahead and turn that over to you so you can introduce Mr. George Ramsey.
Thank you so much. So our next presenter is Mr. George Ramsey, and he'll be giving a presentation on therapy options that are available at Bethune-Cookman University. A little bit about Mr. George Ramsey is he is a native of Camden, Alabama, and has lived in Orlando, Florida since the early 1990s. Since 2016, he has worked as a licensed mental health counselor for Bethune-Cookman, where he is responsible for providing counseling and other mental health services for students. His community activism has led him to become on being one of the member of the advisory board in Orange County, Florida. He has been recognized in the past by former Mayor of Orlando, Teresa Jacobs, for his work in the community, and in 2010 received the Citizen of the Year Award, primarily for his work with youth in Orange County community. Mr. Ramsey has also received a Bachelor of Art degree in communication from Alabama State University and a master's degree from Webster University in Orlando, Florida. He is married and has 4 children. In his leisure time, he enjoys walking, biking, dancing, and traveling.
All right, Mr. George Ramsey.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. And I hope that you can stick around for the question answer segment that's coming up. I think Dr. Holler's presentation was the perfect segue into my brief presentation. But I also want to thank this panel for being here, and especially Dr. Flood and Dr. Holler for making this event possible. We are in a mental health crisis in this country, if not in this world at this point. And we just can't do enough to address the issues of mental health, especially among our students here at Bethune-Cookman University. The mind is a terrible thing to waste. And some of you who are students on this meeting may not recognize that slogan, but that was used back in the perhaps as late as the early 70s and definitely the 80s by the United Negro College Fund. And it was a slogan used to design or devised to encourage African Americans to further their education by going to college. And this particular organization was one to help provide funding for the continual education. So what do you do? What do you turn to? Man, I've seen so many wonderful questions here tonight. Unfortunately, I'm one of those individuals who won't be able to stick around much longer, but I do want to share with you what we have to offer here at Bethune-Cookman University. As you can see, the screen is already there. We at one time enjoyed being a robust full service counseling center. We're not so much there now. We're probably like 80% there. So our services are, somewhat limited, but I think we still do pretty well given the resources that we do have. You see where we're located. We're located next to the mailroom. If you need a physical landmark, it's right next to the band field. The counseling center is committed to providing students with a holistic approach to counseling. And what we're really providing is a focus on your mental wellness. You'll hear the phrase mental health, but I like to think about your mental wellness instead. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The second point is we strive to meet the needs of our students by offering individual counseling, support groups, and linkages to the community. This semester, we were able to provide a support group for grief counseling. We saw a marked increase in death related to students and their family members, and quite a bit of this was as a result of the pandemic. Another group that we had attempted to provide for our students was one for adjustment. There were a lot of students that we saw returning to BCU, former students as well as new students who were just having a very difficult time still adjusting to college life. There are still certain protocols in place that that kind of promoted isolation. And so a lot of our students still had difficulty just readjusting and some adjusting to college because they were first-time students. Our information is here on the screen. We are all licensed mental health counselors. What does that mean? That means we're able to we're clinically evaluate, diagnose, and treat mental health problems and conditions. Next slide, please. As a result of the pandemic, we now are able to provide services using remote locations, and you can see some of the tools we use to do so. Again, the information about who we are is there on the screen. The counseling center generally opens from 8:30 to 7 p.m. My hours are 10 to 7 p.m. And that was put in place because we wanted to kind of have a therapist here a little later on campus to respond to students and their needs after the 5 o'clock close of business hour. Next slide, please. Okay, in addition to the services offered, and I've seen just about everything that has been addressed here tonight by the other presenters, we've seen it all in the counseling center. So you can see on this screen, there are a list of things that students can come to us about. There's really nothing that a student can't not come to us about. We're not necessarily specialists in any area. Ms. Terry James does a wonderful job with grief, but we're more like general practitioners. And so regardless of what you may be struggling with in terms of your mental health, there's a likely chance that we'll be able to address it and perhaps treat it, which includes, but is not limited to, individual therapy, and it can go all the way up to referring you out for psychiatric evaluation, including the Baker Act. Next slide, please. We've already talked a bit about stigmas. Dr. Holler, you mentioned a few things in your presentation about the stigmas that are associated with seeking counseling services. We know for a fact that African Americans view counseling as very distrusting, and I think that has a lot to do with the history of the trauma African Americans has experienced from the time they were brought to this country. And so one of the other services that we provide that we don't necessarily market is psychoeducation. For example, we may be called upon to do trainings here at the university. We've done several trainings this semester. We try to host a number of awareness campaigns to help our students stay aware of mental health issues that are specific to college students. Classroom presentations are not out of the question. If you are a professor on this call and you would like for us to come out and do a presentation on a particular subject, I recently did something on suicide in one of the professor's classes. And we're now currently collaborating with Student Government Association on some things that we can do in conjunction with the Counseling Center and SGA. So you'll see some of that in the spring. For example, we're going to be putting on an event to help students cope with stress. There'll be a mental wellness and nutrition event that we have coming up. In February, we're going to do something called the do's and don'ts of relationships, and perhaps even some yoga. I'm talking about doing some yoga classes on the campus as well. Next slide, please. This next slide is just a continuation of what we've been talking about in terms of African Americans and their viewpoint on therapy. I really want to encourage you all that are listening, that are students that might be studying psychology, make an appointment, come and kind of sit on the couch, see what it feels like, and just feel free to just ask questions about what a therapist does in his or her daily role. Next slide, please. We're not gonna do that video. Here again, the continuation of psychoeducation. In this particular slide, it talks about what we all kind of have a duty to in terms of reporting. We are our brothers and sisters keepers. Most of our referrals that we get come from other students. Okay, I want to repeat that. Most of our referrals that come to us are referred from other students. You can refer someone to the counseling center, and you can do it and remain anonymous. I really want to encourage you to, if you know someone that you think is struggling, don't just refer them, but walk with them, because that first step is very critical. It's a very vulnerable position a person put themselves in when they decide to seek therapy. And the research shows that once a person makes that decision, there's only a certain amount of time to kind of get them in before they decide to change their mind. Next slide, please. All right, here in this particular slide, this is where we kind of empower our students. This is still psychoeducation. Some things, behaviors to look for, behaviors that you might want to report to someone, campus safety, an adult who might help with guiding you in the right direction, substance use, depression, suicidal ideation, all these things that we've already mentioned, we are already dealing with here in the counseling center. I don't think there's anything that has been mentioned here tonight, including homophobia, that we are not currently addressing here in the counseling center. And this is what you have access to as students, because you've already, it's kind of included in your tuition. I really want to strongly encourage you that if you've heard something here tonight that you may not get an answer to, schedule an appointment with one of the individuals in the counseling center. Next slide, please. Here are, just like Dr. Holler ended his presentation, a list of resources that are available out there in the community. One of the things that we do is try to connect with community resources because the counseling center itself can only provide a limited level of services. Sometimes the level of care requires for us to connect with outside resources, be it Halifax Medical Center or some other community partner. So take down some of this information if you feel inclined to. And again, I want all of you, especially the students here tonight, to take advantage of this opportunity to get real life, real time. And I do want to say to this panel, African American counseling. So I know Dr. Holler mentioned how sometimes counseling does not stick because perhaps the counselor that is sitting in front of you can't relate. We are male and we are female, and I think that is a very good plus in terms of seeking counseling here. So I've given you my office information. How would you make a referral, you say, or an appointment? Just email one of us. It's just that simple. There is a way you can go to your health portal to do that. But if you were to just simply call or to just send one of us an email, we can do it that way. Thank you again. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank all of you for hanging in there. Dr. Flood, we haven't met, but we're going to. Dr. Holler, I look forward to seeing you around the campus. And I want to bid all of you a wonderful holiday break. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Ramsey. And again, before I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Dr. Wayne Shepherd, who's here, because Dr. Shepherd created that wonderful flyer that we were using. And thank you, Dr. Payton, as well, who's one of our faculty members, for participating in our presentation. Mr. Ramsey, I'm going to have to invite you to one of our professional seminars now.
Please do, but please do.
Definitely, most definitely. All right, so we'll go ahead. Let me stop sharing that screen, and let's go ahead and open it up for Q&A.
So I'll ask some of the questions that the students and those who are watching the presentation have asked. So the first question is, do you believe that this is from Joylandria Brinson. Do you believe that a person's mental health is directly affected by their environment, whether it's positive or negative? And I believe this question was posed to Dr. Richardson.
Okay, they're asking whether their family environment can cause a mental illness. Is that my understanding of that?
More or less, yes. Is mental health directly affected by a person's environment?
Okay, of course we know that the environment is a strong factor in influencing a lot of things, whether it's a nurturing environment or a hostile environment. But that doesn't necessarily lead to some type of mental disorder. It could lead to stress, anxiety, or depression. But that's on on that side. On the positive side, even homes that appear to be negative have very strong positive factors within that environment. So I would say it doesn't necessarily lead to it. It is a risk for it, but sometimes very nurturing and positive environments, people can still feel lonely and isolated and get depressed. So I would say not necessarily so, but if you feel that something is happening, you need to ask for help to the counseling center if it's a college or one of the hotline numbers, and ask for help if you're feeling that you're depressed, anxious, or having a mental health problem that's causing you some distress.
All right, thank you for that, Dr. Richardson. So in the interest of time, I know this seminar or the symposium is been quite lengthy. We'll probably be asking maybe one or two questions to each of our presenters. So another question that I have from the audience, I think this one is directed to Mr. Hill. Out of all of the pillars, this is from Takari Bell, out of all of the pillars, which one is more difficult for the parents?
Pillars actually tend to work together. They're all congruent into the process of protecting children's right to have access to you. But I'd say the first or the most important would be, well, it is the most difficult, is the education part. Because a lot of parents come in and they want to go straight to their emotions and they forget to understand the actual process. And once they understand the process, then you're able to do some of their emotions. So the education is most likely, or I would say the most difficult for the parents.
All right, thank you for that, Ms. Hill. And another question from our audience. This one is from Jacqueline Williams. What do you do when the mother of the child holds the child from the father?
So this again goes back to the education. Father has to get the documentation in order to hold the courts accountable. It's not about mom, it's about the courts. So once dad is able to address the courts, and I like to write my motions to say, hey, judge, you ordered this. This is what has happened. This is what I suggest you do. And so really about the documentation and being able to present yourself to the courts if mom is actually partaking in some type of alienation. So it's not about mom, it's about the child and the best interest of that child, and you have to address the courts.
All right, thank you for that. And this one, I believe, is not sure who it's directed to, but any one of our presenters could answer this one. This is from Leslie and Simeon. What is the appropriate age for a child, for underage child to seek therapy? Who wants to take a crack at that one? This could be Dr. Richardson, it could be Dr. Holler, it could be Mr.
Dr. Richardson, there's no appropriate age. A child at any age can seek therapy that's verbal and can express themselves. In my family therapy sessions, I talk to all the people in the family group. Every child who was verbal enough to talk and have some understanding of how they felt, then they would participate. Of course, kids who are not verbal and not old enough to understand, but even very young kids can tell you how they feel. It depends on how you ask them. And I would ask young kids, very small, I said, tell me how you feel when your dad and mom are arguing and causing a lot of disruption. Tell me how you feel. And they'll tell you, it scares me, or I feel helpless. They'll tell you things. So there's no age group for me unless they're not old enough to be verbal to understand basic instructions and questions.
Gotcha. Thank you for that.
Go ahead. They're a lot more honest in how they feel than many adults.
Oh,
Adults try to hide and sugarcoat. Kids will tell it just like it is. So
they'll be straight up with you for sure.
yes.
I just want to comment on Dr. Flood. I think I teach the counseling psychology class, and we've had some excellent presentations on play therapy. And a lot of our students are into the expressive arts. And with play, that's the child's way of communicating. So to answer that question, children at any age demonstrate through their play their communication. So the question is a very good one, but the answer is even if they don't have the verbal capacity, their play indicates exactly what is going on for them emotionally.
Thank you for that, Dr. Payton. And I have a question for you as well, Dr. Payton. How would, this is from Kyra Welch, how would I build a conversation of understanding to the parent of a client who is microaggressive or straight up homophobic toward their child's outing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to just comment on Mr. Ramsey's presentation tonight. It was excellent. We've had some excellent counseling sessions outside of the university, but this is the first time we've had 3 competent licensed mental health professionals there. And I think the key to his question goes back to what Mr. Ramsey was talking about, which is cultural competency. And it's so important, and we teach this in our counseling class, that we are all aware about differences in cultures, Asian, Hispanic, Black, white, no matter what it is, we all have to be educated towards cultural competencies. And I think Mr. Ramsey talked about that directly. So the answer to her question, which is a very good one, is a person or a counselor has to have good background, some experience with different kinds of modalities to work with explosive clients, people who are aggressive. And in doing that, if you are not only culturally competent, but also dealing with different levels of emotion, the counselor can be very effective.
All right, thank you. There's some really good questions for you, Dr. Payton. 2 of them are kind of similar, so I'll just read one of them. This is from Mariah Finney. Do you think homosexuality and race have an effect on education?
Yes, that's a good question. I'm going to let some other individuals talk about that one in particular. Yes, I do believe it does affect education. I think there's a lot of discrimination about individuals who are homophobic or homosexual. Discrimination and the possibilities there are abundant. But I'm going to let other people talk about that one. I think it's an interesting question. Dr. Holler or Dr. Shepard, can you chime in on that one? Or Mr. Hill?
So briefly, I'm going to say definitely yes. Your culture and your cultural beliefs and value system bear into your education that you receive. It determines how you perceive the information that you're being taught. So for example, I study race and ethnicity issues, right? So if you're in an educational system that doesn't value your race or ethnicity or doesn't tell you your contributions as a ethnic or racial to the larger society, then you start to feel like you don't belong. You start to feel ineffective. You start to feel like you don't have a story. And I think the same would be true for people in the LGBTQ community because they have a culture. As you know, we have a course here in sociology. We have a gender studies course where those types of issues are discussed. Again, in Dr. Payton's human sexuality class, that culture and perspective are discussed because these are people in our community. These are people that we serve, that we teach, and they want to know about themselves. And I think for anyone being educated, if you're not educated about yourself, only others, then you truly are not educated.
Thank you for that, Dr. Holler. I do have a follow-up question for you. So this one is from Zakira Gleason. Looking at the scatter plot, I'm guessing this was from your presentation. Would you say that the reason for the increase in African Americans and their decrease in other ethnicities would be due to more access given to those other ethnicities than in the African American community? I'm assuming suicide rates.
Right. I think most definitely that is a factor, right? It's not the factor, but it is a factor. So historically, suicide is highest among white men ages 65 and older. It has been that trend, sans Native Americans who have an astronomically high suicide rate, but they're such a small group. We tend to talk about the larger minority or ethnic groups in the country. And historically, white males have the highest suicide completion rate, meaning they die by suicide more than any other group. Now, the rate of increase, though, is greater for Black youth ages 14 to about 24, 25 years old. The rate is greater, even though the raw number of suicides is not greater than white males. The rate of increase is growing faster than other groups. So yes, it could be because historically we're more targeted at suicide in other groups. So there are more programs, there's been more outreach to those communities. And historically, suicide has not been something that was discussed in the Black community, right? And so because you have this negative stigma, we don't talk about these issues. And as we acculturate and assimilate more into Western European values, then we also become at risk for some of the pathology we find traditional to Western European cultures, like risk for suicide, like things that cause body image dissatisfaction or a drive for thinness, because we're assimilating cultural values that are alien to our own. So yes, I do think that there's more focus on treating other groups than in the African-American community, but recently there has been this focus on the Black community because the rate of suicide increases so high, but nobody knows why. This is an area that I study. There's a dearth of research, meaning there's not a lot of people investigating this. They don't really know what's going on. So if you're interested in this area, it is a viable area for you to go into as far as research and help in the community. If you want to be a practitioner or a researcher, there's a spot for you to try to solve this problem, in particular in the Black community. Again, historically, Black people didn't die by suicide, right? We went through the Ma'afa, we went through slavery, chattel slavery in America, and the enslaved Africans weren't killing themselves en masse. But for some reason today, when we have integration and we have liberties and we have the ability to vote and all the other privileges that we are afforded by the Constitution, suicide rate is through the roof, okay? Another reason I think is because Black men in particular are targeted by the society that we live in. There are no social programs for Black men. There are social programs for Black women, but not Black men so much. So where are the programs, right? There are no VOTEC programs anymore in the inner city communities. There are closing community centers where Black youth would go to play and interact with each other socially, right? So we are actually on the fringes of this society that we're trying to belong to. We're made to feel ineffective in this society because there's no place for us. There are no jobs for us, right? So these things, and living in an impoverished environment where there's a lot of pain, trauma, and violence, increase the risk factors for Black men. And again, we're not going to therapy and talking about, I feel depressed and suicidal as a Black man, because traditionally there's a stigma against it. It's not seen as something as a Black man you talk about. You might say, I have a headache, I feel stressed, man, I'm stressed out, whatever the case is. But you don't typically talk about that. One of the reasons why you often see me adorn myself in African attire in my office, if you come to my office, is because it helps me to fortify my mind in this society that I exist in. And it helps me to find my voice. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so vocal about systemic racism, white supremacy. And I talk about those issues because it's good for my mental well-being to do so. Being silent and quiet and not having a voice puts me at risk.
Well said, Dr. Holler. I think that was a very powerful answer to that question. And now I'll leave that as the last question for the night. I want to thank everybody who came to this symposium and still stayed and stuck around and asked questions. We greatly appreciated it. We greatly appreciated it. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Shepard to do our closing prayers. If you could do me the honors, Dr. Shepard.
Yeah, take yourself off mute. Let's Okay, I don't know if he's on mute, but I'll go ahead and close this out if you don't mind.
Not a problem. Go
So
for it.
again,
Dr.
thank you all for joining us. Sorry for some of the technical difficulties that we had, but we pulled through. And I really appreciate everyone that stuck through it. You know, no pun intended about diehards, but for really sticking through this, it shows your level of commitment to your academics, to understanding psychology and how to apply these things that you're learning to your own life and the lives of others. So if we could all, you know, bow your head or close your eyes, we'll take a moment. Father God, thank you for this evening. Thank you for all of our guests and presenters. Thank you for all of our participants that came to listen and learn. Thank you for allowing us to conduct the business of the university, which is to serve our community. And I just want to thank you again for, like I said, our individual differences and collective strengths, because if we work together, we can all become healthier together. In your name I pray, amen.
Amen.
All right. All right, everyone. Thank you. And we'll see you for the next one in the spring.
Have a great evening, y'all.
Excuse
Happy
me.
holidays.
Before the call ends, Dr. Payton, what was the name of the video that you shared during your lecture about homophobia?
You're on mute, Dr.
You're on mute, Dr. Payton.
All right, go ahead. Sorry, who was talking?
My name is Victor Robinson. I'm not a psychology student, but Miss Bonner invited me.
Okay, I can send the link to Miss Bonner. With that, I don't have your email, Victor. If you put it in the chat, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Just put your email address in the chat box and I'll send it to you, okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome, thank you.
And just so you all know, I recorded this. So if you all, you know, email me or maybe we'll have a session here on campus where we can watch, just let me know. All right. Thank you, everyone, again. And we'll see you in the spring. Happy holidays.
Thank you, Dr. Holler.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Flood.